There is a moment in the archaeological record when the world seems to change too fast. A moment when scattered villages, simple tools, and quiet riverbanks suddenly give way to cities. Writing, astronomy, kingship, temples, irrigation, mathematics, mythology, administration, metallurgy, and monumental architecture. It is a moment so abrupt that it unsettles even the most cautious scholars. Within a narrow window of time, only a few centuries wide on the timeline of human history, civilizations appear not like seedlings struggling toward the sun, but like fully grown forests already rooted in knowledge that should have taken millennia to develop. This moment is roughly 6,000 years ago. It is the dawn of what we call civilization. And yet the closer we look, the more this dawn behaves, less like a sunrise, and more like a light switched on. In southern Mesopotamia, a landscape that for thousands of years had been home to small settlements and pastoral groups suddenly erupts with the appearance of Uruk, a city so complex and so vast that even today its scale is difficult to grasp. It contains administrative districts, storage facilities, standardized weights and measures, monumental temples, sophisticated artwork, and a system of writing that appears in its earliest layers already functioning. There is no crude prototype of cuneiform hiding beneath the first tablets. The earliest examples show an established script, a visual system with rules, categories, and symbolic depth. Before we go any further, I'd love to hear from you. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight and what time it is there. I always enjoy seeing how this journey gathers people from every corner of the world. And just a small note, the images you see are here simply to set the atmosphere, so enjoy them in whatever way feels right for you. A similar surprise appears in the Nile Valley. For millennia, people lived in small Neolithic communities, producing pottery, farming the floodplains, burying their dead in modest graves. Then within a short stretch of time, the landscape transforms into the world of mastabas, hieroglyphs, ceremonial centers, large-scale stone construction, and structured religious ideology. The first kings appear not as tentative leaders, but as figures surrounded by institutions and iconography that seem already ancient. As with Mesopotamia, Egypt begins not as a fragile experiment, but as a confident declaration of order. Farther east in the Indus Valley, the pattern repeats. Harappa and Mohenjo-daro rise with meticulous street planning, advanced drainage, standardized brick ratios, and a symbolic system that scholars still cannot decipher. What makes this even more puzzling is that these features appear at the beginning of the civilization, not at its end. There is no visible ramp up, no slow accumulation of complexity. The system arrives in a mature state, as though drawn from memory or from a blueprint that has not survived. Mainstream explanations exist, and they are reasonable. As populations grew, pressures mounted, agriculture stabilized, rivers offered predictable cycles, trade networks expanded. Humans clustered into denser communities which forced them to organize more effectively. Climatic changes created environmental constraints that encouraged social stratification. It is possible to explain each leap using models of innovation diffusion and demographic energy, but even within these frameworks, something remains unresolved. Civilizations do not tend to appear simultaneously across entire continents without leaving behind developmental steps. Yet the steps are missing. The layers beneath these earlier civilizations do not hold the expected prototypes. They do not contain evidence of gradual experimentation. They hold silence. And silence is rarely a neutral thing. It raises questions that linger longer than the answers provided. How did writing appear at nearly the same moment in Sumer and Egypt as sophisticated systems rather than clumsy trial forms? How did large-scale construction begin with projects that seemed too advanced for societies supposedly taking their first steps toward monumentality? How did cosmological frameworks emerge with references to cycles and patterns that required centuries of observation? Why do the earliest administrative systems behave with a precision that suggests refinement rather than invention? A common reply from archaeology is that the earlier evidence has not been found or has been lost. And this is entirely possible. Rivers move. Cities are built on older cities. Organic materials decay. Sand buries entire worlds. Much of the earliest human story remains hidden simply because time is a relentless editor. Yet the pattern still feels unusual. It repeats across regions that had little contact. It repeats in ways that suggest a deeper underlying shift. Something changed around 6,000 years ago. Something profound enough to alter the trajectory of human society, yet subtle enough to leave few direct fingerprints. Some researchers point to climate. Around this period, the world experienced a significant aridification event that reshaped landscapes from the Sahara to the Indus. Populations compressed into more habitable zones. Such compression can accelerate innovation. Competition can create sudden leaps. When people are forced to reorganize their world quickly, the results can look like abrupt beginnings. But there is another interpretation less comfortable, but equally compelling. When something appears too suddenly too complete, and in too many places at the same time, it may not be a beginning. It may be a resurfacing. This idea does not require imagining lost super-civilizations or technologies beyond our comprehension. It requires only the recognition that human knowledge is fragile and that memory can fracture. If earlier cultures carried symbolic or practical knowledge passed down through oral traditions that stretched into the late Pleistocene, then the rise of civilization may reflect not invention but reassembly, a rediscovery of fragments kept alive through rituals, myths, alignments, and narratives that had persisted long after the original context disappeared. In this view, the sudden appearance of cities and writing is not surprising. It is inevitable. When the world stabilized enough for humans to gather again in dense populations, the fragments of older knowledge could finally find each other. They could be woven back into coherent forms. They could become systems. This would explain why the earliest civilizations feel older than they appear, why their myths speak of ages that preceded them, why their symbols resonate with patterns that seem deeper than their own histories, why the first cities look like restorations rather than inventions. And yet this interpretation is not embraced easily. Science demands caution. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. But the archaeological record is not offering extraordinary claims. It is offering anomalies, discontinuities, silences, and those silences invite questions. The sudden dawn of civilization is one of those questions. And as we stand at the threshold of this story, the ancient world feels both familiar and strangely foreign. It feels like a memory half awakened, a memory waiting for its missing pieces. To find those pieces, we must follow the trail into the deeper layers, into the cultures that came before Sumer, before Egypt, before the Indus. The ones that left behind symbols without scripts, architecture without cities, and fragments without explanations. Before civilization appeared suddenly, there were cultures that flickered like distant stars. Their light has not vanished. It simply waits beneath the surface. If we listen carefully, their voices begin to rise. When archaeologists reconstruct the rise of civilization, they expect to find a staircase. At the bottom, simple villages. Above them, transitional towns. Higher still, early centers of administration, craft specialization, and ritual complexity. Finally, at the top, the first great cities with rulers, writing, monumental architecture, and structured social hierarchies. The staircase does not need to be perfect. It does not need to be symmetrical. But it must exist. Yet when we examine the earliest layers of human civilization, the staircase is not there. Instead, we encounter a cliff face. Mesopotamia offers the clearest example. Before Uruk becomes the first city, The landscape is dotted with small farming villages and pastoral encampments. They are modest, functional, and consistent with the Neolithic world. But none of them hint at what is about to emerge. Their pottery is straightforward. Their architecture is simple. Their social organization shows little sign of stratification. In theory, there should be dozens, perhaps hundreds, of intermediate settlements bridging this world and the world of monumental temples and bureaucratic control. But the intermediate forms are missing. Archaeologists have searched for them. Some have proposed that these stages lie buried beneath later construction, waiting to be uncovered. Others suggest they were erased by river shifts or destroyed by natural forces that selectively removed precisely the layers that would help complete the narrative. These possibilities cannot be dismissed. Archaeology is never complete, and absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. But the absence persists. It is not a gap in one site. It is a pattern repeated across regions. In Egypt, the story is similar. Pre-dynastic settlements show little sign of the organizational machinery required for what appears next. Complex royal tombs, specialized labor forces, ceremonial infrastructure, and an ideological system coherent enough to guide an entire civilization. Where are the prototypes of monumental stonework? Where are the administrative villages that should precede a unified kingdom? Where are the trial efforts, the failed experiments, the half-formed structures that normally accompany the birth of a sophisticated society? They do not appear in the layers where they should. Instead, the archaeological record leaps. In the Indus Valley, the leap is even more dramatic. Before Harappa and Mohenjo-daro arise, the region hosts scattered farming communities with simple layouts. Then the landscape transforms into an urban system so standardized that even modern planners would admire its discipline. Streets align in grids. Brick ratios follow mathematical precision. Drainage systems follow unified principles across cities separated by hundreds of kilometers. There should be transitional towns demonstrating the gradual evolution of these standards. Yet the transitions are faint or entirely absent. At this point, scholars often turn to environmental explanations. Climate instability can force rapid adaptation. A sudden river shift can consolidate populations. A resource bottleneck can trigger centralization. These mechanisms are real, and they have shaped human societies many times. But even rapid adaptation leaves traces. It produces hybrid settlements, mixed architectural styles, partial adoption of new technologies, and a spectrum of experimental forms. None of these appear with the clarity expected in the earliest cradles of civilization. Instead, the archaeological record behaves as though the first civilizations were assembled from fragments already known. The missing steps become even more intriguing when we look not at architecture, but at knowledge. In Sumer, the earliest tablets show advanced accounting systems and complex symbolism. If writing had evolved slowly, we would expect earlier layers filled with proto-scripts, crude attempts, inconsistent signs, and partial structures. Those layers are thin or missing. In Egypt, hieroglyphs begin with a fully developed system of phonetic and semantic components. In the Indus Valley, the earliest signs used in seals and tablets already follow rigid placement rules. This is not how inventions normally behave. This is how inheritances behave. The possibility that early civilizations inherited conceptual frameworks rather than invented them disrupts our usual narratives. It suggests that some forms of knowledge may have circulated long before the societies that recorded them. This does not imply advanced lost cultures. It implies continuity. Continuity that is invisible in the archaeological layers because it passed through oral traditions, ritual practices, or scattering population groups whose material traces never fossilized into the story we can excavate. Consider a simple analogy. A musical tradition may survive through generations even if no instruments or written notation survive. the music does not appear in the archaeological record. But when instruments eventually emerge, the complexity of the music may already be there. The first recording would not show a beginner learning notes. It would show a tradition already refined. Civilizations may work the same way. If symbolic systems, architectural instincts, or organizational patterns survived in intangible forms, then their sudden appearance in material form would seem abrupt, even inexplicable. But the knowledge behind them would have been evolving invisibly long before. There is another possibility, one equally grounded in science. The transitional settlements may have existed along coastlines wiped out by rising seas at the end of the last ice age. Vast areas of habitable land disappeared beneath water between 12,000 and 6,000 years ago. Any villages, shrines, workshops, or early centers of complexity built along those coasts now lie beneath continental shelves. The missing steps may simply be underwater. But even this explanation leaves questions unanswered. Why do the earliest cities appear not as experiments, but as mature systems? Why do we not see the expected diversity of forms that normally emerges when societies invent complex structures independently? If Sumer, Egypt, and the Indus all developed civilization on their own, their earliest forms should differ. But they do not differ as much as expected. They share patterns, they share instincts, they share structural logic. This is not evidence of direct contact. It is evidence of a shared problem, and perhaps a shared memory. When early civilizations designed their temples, they oriented them to the sky. When they built their administrative systems, they used controlled quantities and standardized measures. When they carved their myths, they spoke of an earlier age that preceded their own. These similarities may not reflect shared origins. They may reflect shared fragments of a symbolic worldview passed across generations by people who no longer understood the full meaning of what they preserved. The missing steps may not be missing at all. They may be hidden inside the earliest steps we have, compressed within them like layers folded by geological pressure. Perhaps this is why the first civilizations feel strangely old. They look like the survivors of something, not the pioneers. They look like the end of a story we cannot see, rather than the beginning of the story we think we know. If this is true, then to understand the rise of civilization, we cannot focus only on the cities that appear suddenly. We must look at the quieter cultures that came before them. Cultures whose traces linger in symbols, architecture, ritual, and memory. Cultures that flicker at the edges of recorded history but never quite enter it. They are the ones who hold the key to the missing steps, and they are the ones who disappear just as the great civilizations begin to rise. The question is not why they vanished. The question is what they carried that helped shape the world emerging after them. If the earliest civilizations appear too suddenly, then the cultures that came before them behave in the opposite way. They rise quietly, leave behind fragments that do not align with their time, and then vanish without forming the empires they seemed poised to build. These cultures do not announce themselves. They do not carve their names into stone. They do not leave great monuments. Instead, they linger like half-remembered dreams, brief glimmers of complexity that should have led somewhere but did not. When you move through the archaeological layers of the 7th and 6th millennia BCE, you feel their presence. Not in the loud way civilizations declare themselves, but in a more subtle form, like faint pressure in the air. Their symbols, figurines, shrines, and patterns do not shout. They hum. Çatalhöyük is one of these places. On the open plains of Anatolia, its ruins rise not as a city in the traditional sense, but as a honeycomb of interconnected homes with no streets, no walls, and no central authority. And yet the interiors of these dwellings tell a different story. Murals of leopards, vultures, geometric forms, and human rituals cover the walls. Burials are arranged beneath sleeping platforms, suggesting complex beliefs about ancestry and cycles of life. There is order here, but it is not political. It is symbolic. Archaeologists describe Cataluyuk as a large Neolithic settlement, but the symbolic sophistication inside its homes feels older, deeper, as if inherited from traditions no longer visible. Why would a society without kings, temples, or elites produce iconography so consistent and rich? Why would individuals invest so much in internal ritual spaces while leaving the public landscape unmarked? This imbalance is unusual. It suggests a worldview that did not need cities to express itself. A worldview carried quietly, perhaps for generations, until the settlement faded and the symbolic language fragmented with it. Further to the south, on the edges of Mesopotamia, the Ubaid culture emerges like another puzzle. Their settlements are not large, yet their artifacts display an unexpected standardization. Pottery styles spread over vast distances, not through empire, but through cultural continuity. Figurines with elongated heads and slender bodies appear across sites, their meaning unknown. They do not resemble the later gods of Sumer. They resemble something older, something almost alien to the later Mesopotamian symbolic world. The Ubaid did not build monumental architecture. They did not write. They did not leave king lists or myth cycles. Yet somehow their cultural patterns seep into the early foundations of Sumer. Settlement plans, iconographic hints, agricultural layouts, and certain ritual structures show subtle echoes. It is as if the Ubaid acted as a bridge, carrying knowledge they themselves did not originate. But bridges are often forgotten once travellers reach the other side. In the Indus region, before the great cities rose, sites such as Mehrgarh exhibit advanced craft traditions that seem too early for their context. The beadwork in particular stands out. Tiny stones drilled with microscopic precision appear in layers thousands of years before the height of Harappan civilization. These beads require skill, experimentation, and delicate hand techniques, yet the archaeological record does not show long sequences of trial and improvement. The techniques appear mature the first time they appear. Then they disappear. When cities later rise in the Indus Valley, the same beadwork returns, almost unchanged, as if revived. How does knowledge vanish and then reappear so cleanly? How can a tradition leave no trail of continuity, no apprentice stages, no gradual deterioration? It suggests that craft memory may operate like oral memory, preserved in scattered communities that rarely leave lasting material traces. Across the forests and rivers of southeastern Europe, another quiet culture emerges. The Vinca. They do not form cities. They do not raise monumental architecture, yet they leave behind thousands of small artifacts inscribed with symbols. These symbols are not random decorations. They repeat. They cluster. They follow patterns that suggest intentionality. Some scholars propose that the Vinca created a proto-writing system long before Sumer. Others argue that the symbols reflect ritual or mnemonic systems rather than linguistic content. What makes the Vinca remarkable is not the symbols themselves, but their spread. They appear over vast distances with astonishing consistency. This implies either robust communication or a shared heritage. Neither fits the standard model of Neolithic Europe. And yet the symbols persist for centuries before fading without apparent descendants. It is difficult to look at these artifacts and not sense the ghost of something older. In China, along the Yellow River, Jiahu presents another anomaly. Tortoise shells carved with signs appear at this site nearly 7,000 years ago. They resemble in some ways the later oracle bone script of the Shang dynasty, though they are separated by millennia. These early signs could be ritual marks, clan identifiers, or symbolic records. Their meaning remains contested, but their presence in a Neolithic setting raises uncomfortable questions. Why would a simple farming community develop a symbolic system that anticipates a later writing form? Why do these symbols appear suddenly and disappear just as suddenly? As with the other silent cultures, Jiahu communicates a message without explaining itself. When viewed individually, each of these cultures seems like an isolated deviation from the expected path towards civilization. But when viewed together, they form a pattern. They suggest that complexity did not rise in a smooth curve but flickered across landscapes in uneven bursts. Symbolism appeared here, then vanished. Craft mastery emerged there, then disappeared. Ritual forms arose in isolated pockets, only to dissolve before the next era could absorb them. These cultures do not behave like precursors. They behave like remnants. Remnants of traditions that did not originate with them. Traditions that they carried but did not fully understand. Traditions that later civilizations would rediscover in more visible forms. If the first great civilizations seem too complete at their inception, perhaps it is because the world before them was not empty. Perhaps it was filled with symbolic networks, regional knowledge systems, and cultural memories that never developed into states but lasted long enough to seed ideas across continents. Archaeology often focuses on what survives, but most of human history existed in forms that do not preserve well. Wood, woven fibers, pigments, temporary structures, oral traditions, movement patterns, and shared mental models leave faint traces at best. When these traces vanish, the story dissolves with them. What remains are small artifacts that serve as the only surviving notes from forgotten songs. Catalhoyuk, Ubaid, Mergar, Vinca, Jiahu. They are notes, fragments of melodies, hints of a composition that once stretched across regions that no longer exist in the same form. They do not answer the central question of how civilization arose, but they complicate it. They suggest that what appears sudden in the archaeological record may reflect not a beginning, but a convergence. Streams of older knowledge flowing together in ways we can no longer fully see. To follow these streams, we must turn to the civilizations that claim to remember a time before their own, a time of kings before the flood, a time of ancestors whose names are lost, a time of the first order, the first rituals, the first world. If the silent cultures hint at a forgotten memory, the earlier civilizations speak of it directly, and they speak with a confidence that demands we listen. If the silent cultures before civilization speak only through fragments, the Sumerians do something far more unsettling. They speak directly. Their clay tablets, some of the oldest written documents in human history, do not treat the birth of civilization as a mystery. They treat it as a memory. And that memory begins long before Sumer itself. Among the most puzzling texts is the Sumerian king list. At first glance, it appears to be a simple dynastic record. City names, kings, lengths of reign, transfers of power, nothing unusual. But then the list extends into a world that should not exist. It describes rulers who lived before the flood, rulers whose reigns stretch across thousands of years, rulers associated with places that are both familiar and strangely distant. And when the tablet reaches the Great Flood, a line appears that changes everything. And after the flood had swept over, kingship descended from heaven again. Archaeologists often interpret these earlier sections as myth. They assume exaggerated numbers reflect symbolic cycles rather than historical chronology. And this explanation makes sense. Myth is woven into every early culture. But what troubles scholars is not the mythic content itself. It is the way myth blends seamlessly into the historical record. There is no narrative shift, no change in tone, no separation between the world of gods and the world of cities. The king list moves from the extraordinary to the ordinary without acknowledging a boundary. To the Sumerians, both worlds were part of the same story. Why? Why would a civilization as sophisticated as Sumer, a culture that developed writing, law, mathematics, and astronomy, record its earliest memories without distinguishing metaphor from history? Why did their scribes treat antediluvian kings as real rulers? Why did they insist that kingship was a legacy restored rather than invented? The simplest answer is that they were preserving traditions older than their own understanding. They wrote what they had inherited. In tablets from Eridu, one of the oldest cities in Mesopotamia, we find additional clues. Long before monumental temples, long before the ziggurats that tower over the later landscape, Eridu contains a sequence of sacred structures built one on top of another. The earliest layers are modest, but they are not experimental. Their layout seems deliberate. Their orientation follows patterns that do not align with the rudimentary expectations of Neolithic society. It is as if the builders were following a plan passed down from earlier generations. These early temples are not crude prototypes. They are confident statements of purpose. That confidence demands explanation. According to mainstream interpretations, Eridu's sacred architecture reflects the beginnings of organized religion and the consolidation of political power. But this still does not answer the deeper problem. Why do the earliest temples in Eridu, which predate the rise of the city itself, already display coherence and symmetry? Why do they lack signs of incremental development? Why is their symbolic system already mature? A tradition does not begin at its peak. It arrives there through long evolution, unless the evolution happened elsewhere, or was recorded in forms now lost. The Sumerians themselves seem to acknowledge this. In several early texts, scribes refer to rituals restored from earlier days. They mention ceremonies whose meaning had been forgotten. They describe instructions that derive from times when the great gods walked among humans. Some tablets even express regret, words we no longer remember how to read, hymns whose melodies have been lost, festivals that must be reenacted without knowing their original significance. This is not the voice of a culture inventing itself. It is the voice of a culture attempting to remember. Consider their mythology. It is not a mythology of beginnings. It is a mythology of recovery. After the flood, the gods restore order. After chaos, the world is reorganized. After a break in continuity, knowledge returns. The flood, then, is not a symbolic cleansing. It is the boundary between two worlds, the world before and the world after, the world remembered but unreachable. Archaeology supports at least part of this narrative. Deep sediment layers in parts of Mesopotamia indicate large-scale flooding during the late prehistoric period. Though not a global deluge, these local catastrophes would have devastated early settlements. Oral traditions can transform regional events into cosmic stories over centuries. But what remains consistent in the Sumerian version is not the catastrophe, but the idea of restoration. Civilization returns. Kingship returns. Knowledge returns. This emphasis on return raises another question. From where? If we consider the earliest astronomical tablets from Mesopotamia, the puzzle deepens. They already contain references to star paths, lunar cycles, and organizational schemes that should have required long-term observation. Yet these tablets appear very early in the record of Sumer. How could a newly emerging civilization accumulate such precise information so quickly? Even if we assume intensive observation over several generations, the depth of the knowledge still seems disproportionate, unless the knowledge predates the writing system used to record it. In this sense, Sumerian writing may not have been an invention, but a vessel, a way to preserve something older that could no longer be entrusted to memory alone. Linguistics adds to the complexity. Sumerian is a language isolate. It has no known relatives. It does not fit into any established language family. It stands alone, as if severed from its origins. A linguistic orphan in a region full of Indo-European and Semitic branches. Languages become isolates when their parent families vanish. For that to happen, entire populations must disappear, disperse, or assimilate beyond trace. Such events are possible, especially around periods of environmental instability. But the timing is striking. Sumerian appears in its written form already highly structured, with grammar and vocabulary that feel old, not emerging. It is the linguistic equivalent of an adult stepping into the room without childhood photos. Despite all these anomalies, researchers caution against speculation. Civilizations can advance rapidly when conditions align. Oral knowledge can travel far, carried by migrating groups or religious specialists. Ritual memory can preserve ideas long after the original context fades. But these explanations feel incomplete when taken alone. It is only when they are combined with the king list, the temple layers of Eridu, the early astronomical records, and the language isolate question that a more coherent picture begins to emerge. A picture in which Sumer is not the first chapter of civilization, but the first surviving chapter. The earlier chapters may have been erased by flood, climate collapse, or the silent turning of time. Their settlements may lie under sediments or submerged coastlines. Their symbols may survive only in faint echoes within the traditions of the cultures that followed. Sumer's own texts confirm this tone. They do not claim to be innovators, they claim to be inheritors. And inheritors always carry fragments of a story larger than themselves. If Sumer remembers a world before the flood, Egypt carries its own memory of a time before kings. To understand how civilizations perceived their beginnings, we must cross the desert, follow the Nile, and listen to another ancient voice echoing from a different landscape. Where Sumer remembers a flood, Egypt remembers a first time. When the ancient Egyptians spoke of their origins, they did not speak of a beginning. They spoke of a return, a restoration. The reawakening of an order established in a time so distant that even they considered it mythic. This forgotten age had a name, Zep Tepi, the first time. To the Egyptians, Zep Tepi was not a poetic metaphor. It was the blueprint for the world as it should be. The gods had shaped the land, ordered the sky, raised the primordial mound from the waters, and given humanity the laws that sustain balance. Every pharaoh, every ritual, every temple alignment was an attempt to mirror that moment. They did not seek progress. They sought restoration. This distinction is crucial. Civilizations that see themselves as innovators build forward. Civilizations that see themselves as restorers build backward, toward an origin they believe was superior. Egypt belongs firmly to the second category. Yet when we examine the archaeological record of the earliest dynasties, the physical evidence supports something stranger still. The first great constructions in Egypt do not appear as tentative experiments in stone. They appear fully conceptualized. The mastabas, the complex enclosures, the carefully aligned ceremonial spaces, the stone vessels carved with techniques that defy simple tools, the subterranean chambers smoothed to uncanny precision. None of this resembles the beginning of an architectural tradition. It resembles the memory of one. Mainstream archaeology explains this as the product of rapid social organization, a strong centralized state, skilled craftsmen, abundant labor, political motivation. These factors certainly shaped Egyptian civilization, but they do not explain the absence of developmental stages. They do not explain why the earliest stone craftsmanship surpasses that of later periods. They do not explain why certain technologies appear sharply at the start and then degrade over time. If Egypt were learning, its first steps should be crude. But they are not. They are assured. Consider the enigmatic stone vessels found in pre-dynastic graves. Some are made of diorite and schist, stones harder than copper tools. Their walls are impossibly thin. Their interiors are smooth in ways difficult to reproduce, even with modern equipment. These vessels do not emerge from a long lineage of experimentation. They emerge fully formed, with no obvious ancestors and no clear successors. Their presence in the earliest layers is one of the great puzzles of Egyptian archaeology. Then there is Saqqara. When Imhotep designed the step pyramid complex for King Djoser, he did not build a simple tomb. He created an architectural universe: courtyards, colonnades, ritual chambers, a symbolic map of creation itself, and beneath the pyramid, tunnels and chambers cut with such precision that they could pass for the work of a later dynasty. What makes Saqqara remarkable is not that it is innovative, it is that nothing before it prepares us for it. The transition from modest burials to the vast funerary complex is too abrupt. It lacks the exploratory missteps that normally accompany technological jumps. Instead, the earliest large-scale stone architecture arrives with confidence, intention, and symbolic sophistication. This pattern reflects a deeper truth about Egypt. The civilization always spoke of an age before kings, a lineage called the followers of Horus. They appear in king lists preceding the dynastic rulers. They are referenced in temple inscriptions. They are depicted not as gods, but as beings who maintained order before the unification of Egypt. Who were they? Some Egyptologists interpret them as early chieftains or mythic ancestors. Others see them as symbolic placeholders for a lost era. But their presence across multiple records challenges the idea that they are merely narrative decoration. They represent continuity, not invention. The Egyptians themselves did not believe they were the first to rule their land. They believed they were the first to restore it after a long decline. Even the Palermo stone, one of the oldest king lists, includes a section describing rulers of pre-dynastic times, long before the earliest archaeological evidence of formal kingship. Their reigns are impossibly long, echoing the Sumerian list of antediluvian kings. Two civilizations far apart, two traditions, two versions of a story that begins before history begins. It is difficult to ignore the parallel, but Egypt offers something more concrete than memory. It offers alignment. The earliest temples and ceremonial structures often face specific heavenly events: the rising of certain stars, the movement of constellations, the appearance of Sirius before dawn. But some early alignments do not match the sky of the early dynastic period. They match a sky thousands of years older. If a culture inherits architectural or ritual blueprints from earlier generations, the alignments may reflect the original epoch, not the later one. A temple aligned to a star that no longer rises in the same position suggests not error, but memory. One of the most striking examples comes from the region of Nekhen, where certain structures appear aligned to stellar events that would have occurred not in 3000 BCE, but around 5000 BCE or earlier. This does not make sense in a society just learning to build. But it makes sense in a society continuing a tradition whose roots reach further back than its own written history. Egypt's priests seemed aware of this disconnect. In later periods, they described rituals reconstructed from writings they no longer understood. They lamented the loss of sacred knowledge. They spoke of reviving practices from an age whose origins were forgotten. Their words carry the same quiet sorrow found in the oldest Sumerian texts. This is the sound of a civilization standing on ruins it cannot see. What happened before Egypt? What world transmitted these fragments of astronomical, ritual, and architectural knowledge? How did a Neolithic Nile Valley produce a symbolic system so refined that it persists unchanged for millennia? Why does early Egypt feel like a continuation rather than a beginning? These questions do not accuse, they invite. Science offers reasonable explanations: cultural memory, oral traditions, migration of specialist groups, regional interactions, the human mind's instinct for pattern. But archaeology adds another layer: the silence beneath the earliest monumental structures, the absence of prototypes, the sudden architectural leap, the technological decline that follows. These features suggest a past erased not gradually, but abruptly. And into that silence, The Egyptians projected their first time. Zep-Tepi was not an origin myth. It was a statement of identity, a declaration that the world had once been whole and that their purpose was to restore it. Whether this first time refers to real events, symbolic truth, or cultural memory transformed by centuries, it carries weight because it is not isolated. Sumer had its antediluvian kings. Egypt had its first time. Other civilizations tell similar stories. When different cultures remember the same pattern, we should not dismiss it. We should ask what the memory is trying to preserve. Egypt, with its temples aligned to ancient skies and its craftsmanship that peaks at the beginning, holds a key. But it is not the only key. To understand whether these memories reflect isolated myth or shared history, we must look beyond the Nile and the two rivers. We must look upward. Because when we follow the path of these early civilizations, the next clue does not lie in the earth, but in the stars. If the earth beneath ancient civilizations holds contradictions, the sky above them holds even more. At first glance, the earliest astronomical traditions of Sumer, Egypt, and other ancient cultures appear to reflect simple observation. Farmers watching seasons, priests tracking the moon, navigators marking the rising of stars. This is the expected picture: humble, slow, and grounded. But when we examine the earliest astronomical alignments, something unusual emerges. The sky encoded in the earliest temples and celestial lists does not always match the sky of the era in which those cultures flourished. Instead, some alignments fit older epochs, as if they were copied from memories belonging to a different sky, one that no longer existed when the monuments were raised. This idea seems strange, even improbable. Civilizations should orient their temples and rituals based on the heavens they themselves observe. But evidence from multiple regions suggests something else was happening. The builders appear to be reconstructing a celestial pattern they believed held eternal significance, a pattern that may have been passed down across generations long after its original context faded. Consider the phenomenon of precession. The Earth's axis slowly wobbles over a cycle of roughly 26,000 years. Because of this, the position of stars shifts gradually over long periods. A star that once rose at the equinox may rise at a different point thousands of years later. Early cultures could not have known the mechanics of precession unless they observed the sky for far longer than their archaeological timelines allow. Yet their monuments seem aware of it. In Egypt, temple alignments often point toward the rising of specific stars or the solstitial sun. Some of these alignments make perfect sense within the Old Kingdom period, but others match star positions as they would have appeared thousands of years earlier. A handful of temple orientations align with the heliacal rising of stars, whose positions correspond to epochs around 5000 or even 7000 BCE. Mainstream explanations suggest either chance alignments or inherited symbolic frameworks not tied to real observation. But the precision of some of these alignments challenges the idea of coincidence. If a culture inherits a blueprint for sacred architecture, the blueprint may carry astronomical orientations that once held meaning, even if the sky has changed. In that case, early Egyptians might have faithfully copied orientations from older traditions, unaware that precession had altered the sky. This possibility shifts the question. It is not whether the Egyptians understood precession, it is whether the people who first created the original blueprint did. Sumer also presents puzzles. The earliest star lists from the region contain groupings that resemble constellations used thousands of years later. Their tablets mark lunar cycles, solstitial points, and celestial pathways with surprising sophistication. The systematic nature of this knowledge implies long continuity, yet the writing used to record it appears suddenly, with no visible developmental stages. How can a culture begin writing and immediately record astronomical systems that appear refined rather than experimental? One explanation is migration. Groups knowledgeable in astronomy could have arrived in Mesopotamia, bringing traditions that predated the local writing system. But this again raises the question of where that knowledge originated and how long it had been preserved orally. Even in regions not typically associated with early astronomy, anomalies arise. The stone circle at Nabta Playa, deep in the Sahara, predates the Egyptian pyramids by thousands of years. Some of its alignments correspond to solstitial points. A few researchers have proposed that certain stones reflect knowledge of precessional change, though this interpretation remains contested. Regardless of motive, the site shows that long before formal civilization, people were marking the sky with intention. The Americas tell a parallel story. Early Mesoamerican cultures tracked Venus with extraordinary precision. Andean cultures built horizon markers capable of predicting solstitial changes. These traditions appear full-formed when they enter the archaeological record. Once again, the missing developmental steps echo across continents. The pattern is not limited by geography. It is limited by time. If multiple early societies inherited fragments of a shared astronomical worldview, these fragments could have diverged and matured differently. What remains consistent is the suddenness with which they appear and the coherence of the systems they preserve. Then there is the question of constellations. Some of the earliest mythological descriptions of the sky in Egypt, Mesopotamia, and even Greece reference star patterns that do not perfectly match the configurations these cultures would have seen. Stories of a cosmic bull, a celestial hunter, a seven-star cluster, and a serpent or dragon appear across civilizations. These motifs resemble constellations, but their descriptions sometimes better match the positions those stars held thousands of years earlier. Astronomers caution against overinterpretation. Myth is flexible. It evolves. It absorbs symbols from many sources. But the consistency of these motifs across time and space suggests a deeper origin. If myths preserve memories of the sky, even loosely, then the sky they describe may belong to an age before written history. An age when the rhythms of the cosmos were critical to survival. An age when catastrophic shifts in climate, forced migrations, and the preservation of star knowledge became essential. When early priests oriented temples to a sky that no longer matched their own, they may have believed they were restoring cosmic order. To them, the first time or the pre-flood era represented not a mythical past but a pattern of balance. Their goal was not to innovate but to remember. This idea takes us to the heart of the mystery. What would compel multiple civilizations to anchor their earliest monuments to a sky configuration that no longer existed? Why would they treat ancient star patterns as sacred? Why preserve alignments that no longer match the visible heavens? Unless those alignments were part of a legacy they felt obligated to maintain. A legacy from where? Science offers explanations rooted in human cognition. Our species is adept at pattern recognition. We project order, we ritualize structure, we inherit narratives. Precessional alignments may result from long-term observation, not long-term memory. Myths may converge because human societies respond to similar environmental pressures. These interpretations help, but they do not close the gap. The earliest astronomical knowledge still arrives in forms too complete. If inherited, then someone earlier preserved them. If observed, then someone earlier watched the sky for far longer than the archaeological record shows. If reconstructed, then the reconstructions were guided by a framework that predates the civilizations that revived it. The sky does not lie. It shifts constantly. It erases its past unless recorded. Yet these cultures acted as if the past sky still mattered. Perhaps it did. To understand how ancient people could inherit knowledge that seems older than their own societies, we must look not at the heavens, but at the symbols they carved into clay, bone, stone, and pottery, because in the next stage of the story, writing appears, not gradually, not experimentally, but fully grown, as if awakened from sleep, and it appears everywhere at once. When writing first appears in the archaeological record, it should look like a struggle. This is what we expect from invention: hesitation, error, variation, symbols that drift in meaning, forms that evolve slowly as scribes refine their craft. But this is not what we find. Instead, writing arrives with maturity, structure, and purpose. It enters history as though stepping onto a stage already lit, already furnished, already waiting for a performance that has rehearsed in secret. In Mesopotamia, the earliest tablets do not contain experimental markings. They contain administrative records, numerical systems, and symbolic clusters that behave as though their creators already understood the purpose and power of writing. The signs are organized. They follow patterns. They encode categories of goods, professions, and rituals. There is order in the clay, order without precedent. Archaeologists explain this by pointing to tokens, those small clay objects used for counting and keeping accounts in the centuries before writing. Over time, the argument goes, these tokens became more complex. They were impressed onto clay surfaces instead of stored in pouches. Eventually, they evolved into pictographic signs. But this explanation has a problem. The leap from tokens to tablets is enormous. Tokens capture quantity. Tablets capture conceptual structure. A token can tell you how many goats you owe. A tablet can tell you who owns the goats, where they will be delivered, on which lunar cycle, under which authority, and within which ritual context. Tokens do not prepare us for this cognitive shift. If writing grew from tokens, we should see many intermediate forms. We should see hybrid stages, part symbol, part imprint, part tally. Yet these transitional layers are thin or absent. The full system appears too quickly. Egypt tells the same story. The earliest hieroglyphs are not rough sketches. They are polished, consistent, and symbolic. They combine phonetic signs, semantic determinatives, logograms, and artistic embellishment. These features require conceptual integration. They require centuries of symbolic tradition. But the archaeological record below them is quiet. When Egypt begins writing, it begins with a system that should not exist at the beginning. The Indus Valley adds another puzzle. Its script, still undeciphered, displays rules of placement and repetition that suggest linguistic content. Short inscriptions appear on seals, tablets, pottery, and administrative objects. The consistency of the signs implies a shared standard, yet there is no gradual build-up toward this system. No earlier markings that show the emergence of a script. It appears, like the scripts of Sumer and Egypt, fully formed. And then it disappears without leaving descendants. China stands apart geographically, but not conceptually. The oracle bone inscriptions of the Shang dynasty represent one of the earliest known writing systems in East Asia. Yet centuries before them, at the Neolithic site of Jiahu, carved signs appear on tortoise shells. Some of these signs resemble later components of Chinese script. Their meaning remains debated, but their presence is undeniable. They appear suddenly, show order, then vanish. The pattern repeats. An early symbolic system emerges without a clear ancestor, then dissolves before the formal writing system appears. Taken individually, these anomalies could be dismissed, but together they form a pattern difficult to ignore. Writing seems to appear in multiple places across the world, not as a tentative invention, but as a recovered structure. A framework restored rather than imagined. Why? One explanation lies in the nature of symbolic cognition. Humans have an innate tendency to create meaning systems. When societies become dense and complex, writing may emerge because the mind pushes toward it. But this does not solve the archaeological problem. Even if the cognitive urge is universal, the material progression should still be gradual. Yet the earliest scripts behave not like sprouts, but like branches of a tree whose trunk is buried. Another explanation points to lost precursors. Perhaps earlier writing systems existed, but were recorded on perishable materials: wood, leather, bark, textiles. These materials decay quickly in most environments. What survives in the archaeological record are the hard, durable artifacts of writing: clay tablets, stone carvings, bone inscriptions. The deeper origins of writing may have been preserved in forms that did not fossilize. This is plausible, but it does not fully account for the sudden standardization we see. Even if early writing vanished, the systems that remain show internal coherence too strong to reflect brand new invention. They look like codifications of traditions that carried meaning long before they were committed to durable materials. A third explanation, more subtle, involves ritual. Many symbolic systems begin not as practical tools but as sacred ones. Symbols carved into ceremonial objects, burial goods, or ritual structures may represent proto-writing in contexts not associated with day-to-day administration. If writing began in temples before it entered bureaucratic life, its early stages may be hidden beneath layers of ritual secrecy. This possibility becomes more intriguing when we consider that writing in several early cultures was controlled by priesthoods. The earliest Sumerian scribes worked in temple complexes. Early Egyptian hieroglyphs appear alongside ritual iconography. In China, oracle bone inscriptions were used to communicate with ancestors and divinities. In these cases, writing did not arise from economic need alone. It arose from cosmological necessity. If writing began as a ritual technology, its earliest forms may have been treated as sacred. Sacred knowledge is often preserved orally. When it eventually becomes material, it enters the world already refined. Which brings us to the most challenging explanation of all: inheritance. It is possible that the earliest writing systems were attempts to formalize symbolic frameworks that already existed in oral or mnemonic traditions. If cultures carried symbolic stories, star knowledge, ritual structures, or conceptual categories across generations, the first written systems would reflect that age-old structure. They would not show gradual evolution. They would show sudden crystallization. In this view, writing is not the birth of civilization, but the moment memory becomes external. The moment knowledge that once lived in bodies, voices, and minds is captured in clay, bone, or stone. If this is true, the earliest scripts are not beginnings. They are endings. The final step in the long decline of a symbolic tradition that once existed in an unwritten form. And yet the most puzzling feature of early writing remains its synchronicity. Around the world, within a relatively narrow span of time, multiple civilizations invent or revive writing. They do so with different signs, different languages, and different structures. But the act itself appears coordinated across continents, not by contact, but by something deeper, a shared moment when writing becomes necessary. What could have triggered this? Climate shifts, population density, religious transformation, the need to anchor knowledge that could no longer be trusted to memory alone, or something even more fundamental, a collective attempt to salvage fragments of a symbolic world on the verge of being forgotten. The scripts have no childhood because their childhood took place in a world whose traces have largely disappeared. A world where memory was carried in ways that did not survive the passage into history, and as we turn from symbols to the human mind that created them, we begin to see why the deepest mysteries of early civilization revolve not around invention, but around forgetting. Because the next question is not how writing appeared so quickly. It is how humanity lost so much before writing arrived. There is a kind of silence in the archaeological record that has nothing to do with stone or soil. It is the silence of forgetting. A silence not created by erosion, fire, or flood, but by the fragile architecture of the human mind. When we look at the deep past, at the strange flicker of cultures rising and falling without apparent connection, a new possibility emerges. Civilization might not have begun with invention. It may have begun with recovery. And recovery implies loss. To understand this loss, we must look not at artifacts but at cognition. The human brain carries memory not only through individuals but through societies. Ideas, rituals, skills, and symbolic systems pass from one generation to the next through teaching and imitation. These systems can endure for thousands of years, surviving without writing, surviving without monuments, surviving even when populations migrate or fragment. But memory, like everything biological, has limits, and when external shocks strike, those limits become visible. Between 12,000 and 8,000 years ago, the world experienced major climatic fluctuations. Ice sheets collapsed, oceans surged, temperatures swung in abrupt cycles, coastlines drowned, hunting grounds disappeared, rivers shifted courses, entire ecosystems reshaped themselves in the span of a few generations. In this environment, any symbolic or technological tradition depended on fragile human networks that could be shattered overnight. The most dramatic global event of this period, the rapid sea level rise at the end of the last glacial era, submerged millions of square kilometers of habitable land. If early societies developed complex symbolic knowledge along coastlines, as human groups commonly do, much of that knowledge would now lie beneath continental shelves. Ruins do not have to crumble to disappear. They only have to sink. But the memory of those traditions would not vanish instantly. People carried fragments inland. They taught what they could. They adapted their rituals to new landscapes. They told stories that held the shape of their past without preserving its details. Myths emerged as mnemonic devices, remembering structure but not chronology. Rituals emerged as echoes of lost practices. Architectural instincts emerged without the technologies that once supported them. This is how collective memory behaves after trauma. It distorts. It compresses. It reshapes itself around what survives rather than what was lost. The Younger Dryas collapse, the subsequent warming, and the dramatic flooding episodes did not simply stress early societies physically, they stressed them cognitively. Communities forced to relocate rapidly lose not only land but knowledge. Skilled craftspeople die, teachers vanish, ritual specialists disappear. The pathways that maintain cultural memory fray one by one. When archaeologists study cultural bottlenecks, they look for reductions in population size. But memory bottlenecks are subtler. They occur when enough transmitters of knowledge vanish that the system collapses even if the population survives. Across the world, we find signs of such collapses. In Anatolia, the symbolic richness of early Neolithic settlements fades in later layers, replaced by simpler motifs. In the Levant, ritual practices involving plastered skulls, complex burial sequences, and symbolic architecture vanish abruptly. In East Asia, certain pottery traditions with sophisticated firing techniques disappear for centuries before reappearing in unrelated regions. This on-and-off pattern looks less like technological evolution and more like cognitive dissonance. The knowledge was present, then the knowledge was lost. Then in some cases, fragments were rediscovered or reinvented. Cognitive archaeologists often describe this as the ebb and flow of cultural scaffolding. Every society relies on scaffolds, material, social, and symbolic structures that support complex knowledge. But scaffolds are vulnerable. When climate disrupts food supply, the time available for ritual and craftsmanship collapses. When groups migrate, scaffolds disintegrate. When elders die, ritual memory fades. The result is a world where complexity does not rise gradually. It rises, collapses, resurfaces, and transforms. By the time we reach the era when writing appears, humanity may already have passed through multiple cycles of remembering and forgetting. The first civilizations documented by writing were not standing at the dawn of complexity. They were standing at the first moment after a long night, attempting to gather the fragments that survived. This perspective reframes the mystery of sudden civilization. It suggests continuity concealed by collapse. Egyptian priests lamented rituals they no longer understood. Sumerian scribes referenced days whose number had been lost. Early Chinese chroniclers spoke of an earlier age when sages held knowledge no longer accessible. These texts do not read like myth, they read like grief. The grief of a species remembering that it once remembered more. We see signs of this cognitive break not only in cultural traditions, but in environmental data. The 8.2 kiloyear event, a sudden global cooling triggered by glacial meltwater, caused famine, migration, and regional depopulation. Archaeological layers from this period show settlement abandonment, technological simplification, and a reduction in symbolic artifacts. Societies retreated inward. The scaffolds weakened. Then, centuries later, complexity rises again. But it rises unevenly, almost as if different regions carried different fragments of an earlier symbolic whole. This explains one of the deepest puzzles of early civilization, the coherence of their symbolic systems despite their geographical isolation. How did so many early cultures share themes of cosmic order, sacred geometry, flood mythology, and cycles of creation and destruction? How did astronomical frameworks appear simultaneously? How did the earliest writing systems behave like codifications of pre-existing mental structures? If cognitive scaffolding shattered under climatic stress, the pieces that survived would spread with migrating populations. Over time, different groups would preserve different fragments. When stability returned, these fragments would crystallize into the earliest civilizations. Each one incomplete. Each one remembering something the others forgot. This also explains why the earliest monumental architecture often appears at full strength. The memory of how to build may have survived, even if the reasons why were lost. A ritual form without context can be preserved through habit. A construction technique can be copied without being understood. A symbolic alignment can be maintained out of reverence rather than knowledge. In this sense, the earliest civilizations may have been archivists rather than inventors. Their temples, scripts, calendars, and myths were attempts to rebuild a shattered memory, not to create a new one. And this brings us to the heart of the mystery. If humanity once possessed a richer symbolic world, where did it go? What event fractured it so thoroughly? Climate alone can cause collapse, but not always uniform forgetfulness. Migration scatters people, but not always ideas. Something about the early Holocene produced an unusually deep rupture in human continuity. Archaeologists are beginning to suspect that the earliest civilizations were not born from a blank slate. They were born from salvage. They rose not because humanity suddenly innovated, but because humanity finally stabilized after centuries of chaos. When that stability returned, the surviving fragments of symbolic knowledge reassembled themselves into the forms we now call civilization. This interpretation does not diminish the achievements of Sumer, Egypt, or the Indus Valley. Instead, it expands them. They were not inventors of civilization. They were its restorers. But if they were restoring something, then what exactly had been lost? What symbolic structures existed before the break? What technologies? What cosmologies? What forms of measure or memory? To find answers, we must look beyond climate and cognition. We must examine the world around 6,000 years ago, when the Earth itself changed in ways that forced humanity into new forms, because the next great shift in the story is not in the human mind. It is in the land beneath our feet. 6,000 years ago, the Earth changed its mind. The shift was not violent, not explosive, not the kind of catastrophe that tears continents apart in a single day. Instead, it was slow, persistent, and relentless. A drying wind passed across northern Africa. Rains faltered, lakes shrank, grasslands receded, and the Sahara, once home to rivers, lakes, and thriving communities, began its transformation into the desert we know today. This transition is known to climatologists as the 9-kilo-year event, a global aridification that reshaped landscapes from the Atlantic coast of Africa to the plains of the Indus Valley. It is one of the great environmental turning points of the Holocene, and one largely hidden from popular memory. Yet without this shift, the first civilizations might never have emerged. Or more accurately, they might never have re-emerged. Before the Sahara dried, it was green. Archaeologists have uncovered rock art depicting cattle, swimming humans, boats, and wildlife that could never survive in today's harsh climate. Settlements once flourished around large lakes, including the now vanished megalake Chad. People lived not in isolation, but in networks of communities linked by water, trade, and ritual. As the rains withdrew, these networks collapsed. Populations abandoned their homes and migrated toward the remaining fertile corridors: the Nile, the Tigris, and Euphrates, the Indus floodplain. What had been expansive territories narrowed into river-bound lifelines. And when people crowd into narrow ecological niches, two things happen: conflict and coordination. History records the coordination. Out of these compressed landscapes came the earliest large-scale social systems. The Nile Valley, once a mere ribbon of settlement, became the backbone of what would later become Egypt. The lower Mesopotamian marshlands, fed by the Tigris and Euphrates, turned into a zone where agriculture, irrigation, and population density forced new forms of organization. In the Indus region, shifting rivers and drying plains compelled communities to centralize or perish. None of these developments occurred in a vacuum. They were responses to pressure. Civilization often emerges not from abundance, but from scarcity. What makes the 5.9-kilo-year event so intriguing is how it aligns with the sudden appearance of fully formed civilizations. The same centuries that saw the Sahara's collapse also saw the rise of Uruk, the consolidation of Egypt, and the first urban forms in the Indus Valley. This synchronicity is not coincidence. Climate channels human behavior as firmly as rivers channel water, but the way these civilizations formed suggests more than simple adaptation. They did not experiment with political structures. They established them. They did not gradually refine architectural traditions. They implemented them. They did not drift into symbolic systems. They codified them. This abruptness mirrors something we saw earlier in the archaeological record: missing intermediate steps. When people migrate under environmental duress, they do not carry material wealth. They carry knowledge, rituals, stories, skills. If pre-aridification societies once held symbolic or technological traditions now lost to time, the 5.9-kilo-year collapse would have forced these fragments into concentrated regions where they could recombine. It is not hard to imagine communities arriving in the Nile Valley with memories of sacred alignments they no longer understood, or groups settling in Mesopotamia with organizational instincts inherited from ancestors dispersed by drought. When symbolic fragments converge, they crystallize into coherent systems. This may explain why the earliest civilizations feel older than they are. Egypt's earliest kingship does not look like a new invention. It looks like the revival of something remembered. Sumer's administrative structures do not resemble simple experimentation. They resemble formal processes adapted to new ecological realities. The Indus Valley's standardized city planning does not behave like an emerging idea. It behaves like a restored template. Climate collapse did not invent these systems. It selected for them. The Sahara's desiccation compressed populations into funnels where cultural fragments that had once been scattered became concentrated. The same process occurred in Mesopotamia when shifting rainfall patterns reshaped marshlands. In the Indus Valley, drying rivers pushed settlements toward more stable floodplains, forcing cooperation and standardization. Environmental stress tests societies. Some fail, some endure, some reorganize into new forms that seem startlingly complex. When archaeologists excavate these early civilizations, the suddenness is always emphasized, but from the viewpoint of climate, nothing is sudden. The environmental pressures of the late Holocene acted like a sculptor, carving away options until only narrow paths remained. Societies walked these paths because they had no choice, but what they carried with them, the symbolic frameworks, the astronomical instincts, the architectural tendencies, those came from older landscapes now erased. The 5.9 kilo-year event did not only dry rivers, it dried memory. When populations disperse unevenly, knowledge scatters. When they reconverge under new pressures, knowledge recombines in unfamiliar shapes. Civilization, then, is not simply the consequence of human ingenuity. It is a consequence of environmental alchemy. We see this pattern clearly at the edge of the Sahara. As pastoral groups retreated, they brought cattle rituals into the Nile Valley, contributing to early Egyptian iconography. In Mesopotamia, migrants from the Arabian Peninsula entered the marshlands, blending with Ubaid descendants to shape early Sumerian culture. In the Indus Valley, people from the drying regions of Baluchistan and the Helmand Basin carried agricultural traditions into the river plains. These flows create hybrid worlds, and hybrids emerge fully formed because they build from fragments, not beginnings. The lesson of the 5.9 kilo-year event is simple. Climate can erase civilizations without leaving ruins. It can dismantle networks, sever symbolic continuity, and scatter communities across landscapes where their identities become diluted. But climate can also force recombination, concentrating cultural memory into places where it takes new forms. It is in this concentrated form that civilization reappears, not as an invention, but as a reconstruction. This helps explain why the earliest monumental constructions in Egypt, Sumer, and the Indus Valley feel like they belong to older worlds. Their builders were remembering under pressure, reassembling under duress, reviving traditions that no longer had intact lineages. But climate is not the only force capable of erasing the past. The Earth has many layers, and some of its most ancient stories are buried under strata of silence. To understand why the earliest civilizations feel so abruptly ancient, we must examine the archaeological layers themselves. The sites that defy chronology, that appear out of sequence, that seem to belong to worlds older than their surroundings. Because the next part of this journey takes us into the forbidden strata, the layers of history that should not exist and yet do. Archaeology is built on layers. The deeper you dig, the older the world becomes. Time arranges itself neatly in soil, newer on top, ancient below. When the pattern holds, history behaves, but sometimes it does not. Sometimes a site presents a layer that does not fit the sequence, a level too advanced for its age or too sophisticated for its context. These layers sit like quiet contradictions, challenging the tidy narrative of human development. Göbekli Tepe is the most famous of these contradictions. High on a ridge in southeastern Anatolia, its carved stone pillars rise from the earth with unexpected grandeur. The site dates to around 10,000 BCE, long before agriculture, pottery, and settled life became widespread. The people who built it were supposed to be simple hunter-gatherers, living in small groups, following migrating herds. Yet the pillars at Göbekli Tepe weigh tons. They support relief carvings of animals, abstract symbols, and humanoid figures executed with unanticipated precision. They stand in circular enclosures that imply architectural planning, ritual intent, and coordinated labor. Nothing about this place fits the model. It does not look like a prototype. It looks like a tradition. Archaeologists have tried to reconcile these facts. Perhaps early communities gathered seasonally to build monuments. Perhaps the demands of ritual drove early social complexity. Perhaps the site is an outlier. These explanations are thoughtful, but they do not fully resolve the problem. Göbekli Tepe's builders possessed skills that do not align with the technological stage assigned to their era. Even more troubling, the site was deliberately buried at the end of its use, as if the people who inherited it could no longer maintain it, or no longer understood it. Travel west into the Mediterranean, and Malta presents another puzzle. The megalithic temples of Menidra and Hagar Kim date to roughly 3600 BCE, older than the Egyptian pyramids and Stonehenge. They contain architectural alignments to solstices, carefully shaped stone blocks, and ritual chambers designed with acoustic resonance. Their sophistication suggests long development, but once again, the earlier stages are missing. There are no experimental structures, no preliminary forms. The tradition appears suddenly, fully grown. At Jericho, one of the oldest continuously occupied sites on Earth, the earliest layers contain a massive stone tower built around 9000 BCE. This tower stands more than 8 meters tall, with an internal staircase carved from stone. The settlement around it was small, simple, and mostly domestic. So why does a monumental structure appear among modest dwellings? Who organized its construction? What purpose did it serve? And why do we not see similar examples in nearby regions until thousands of years later? The pattern continues across continents. At Nabta Playa, in the Nubian desert, ancient nomadic groups constructed stone circles aligned to astronomical events. The site's alignments may suggest awareness of long-term celestial cycles, though this interpretation remains controversial. What is not controversial is the site's age. It predates dynastic Egypt by millennia. Symbolic architecture appears here in the hands of people who, according to standard models, should not have been building anything permanent at all. In the Andes, long before the Inca, early highland cultures created ceremonial sites with stonework that later societies struggled to replicate. In Japan, the Jomon people crafted elaborate pottery with intricate designs far earlier than expected for hunter-gatherer cultures. In the Americas, mound structures appear abruptly in Louisiana thousands of years before the rise of complex societies in the region. These sites, spread across vast distances, share a common theme: abrupt sophistication. Archaeologists often describe them as anomalies, outliers that do not undermine the broader model of human development. But when anomalies appear in many regions, the term loses its meaning. They form a pattern, and patterns demand explanation. The most conservative explanation is that human cognition developed earlier and more fully than previously assumed. Hunter-gatherer societies may have possessed the social complexity and organizational capacity needed to produce monumental architecture long before agriculture made large populations possible. In this view, the early sites are not mistakes in the record. They are reminders of human ingenuity. But this explanation also leaves gaps. If human groups had the capacity to create advanced symbolic architecture, why did these traditions not continue? Why do they appear suddenly, flourish briefly, and then fade for thousands of years? Why do later societies struggle to replicate or understand them? A more nuanced explanation involves cultural bottlenecks. The sites we find may represent the surviving peaks of traditions that were once more widespread. If large regions experience population shocks, migrations, or environmental collapse, the scaffolding required to maintain these architectural traditions may have collapsed with them. What remains are isolated echoes. This interpretation aligns with what we saw in earlier parts, the idea that humanity once held symbolic or technological memory that fractured and dispersed. Göbekli Tepe could represent one of the last expressions of a pre-agricultural symbolic world. Malta might preserve a memory of forgotten maritime cults. Jericho's tower could reflect a ritual system whose context was already fading when the tower was built. There is also the problem of technological regression. In Egypt, the finest stone carving appears in the earliest dynasties, then declines. In South America, some of the most precise stonework predates the Inca Empire by centuries or millennia. In the Indus Valley, standardized brick ratios appear early, not late. Across the globe, the pattern emerges again. Peak sophistication appears at the beginning, not the end. This inversion is difficult to reconcile with linear models of technological progress. It suggests a world where knowledge is inherited but poorly understood, practiced but not mastered, applied but not fully contextualized. A world where people preserve techniques without knowing their origins. If the forbidden layers represent fragments of older knowledge, the question becomes, how old? How far back do these lost traditions reach? Were they local innovations that vanished under stress, or were they the last survivors of a symbolic world that stretched across continents before the end of the Ice Age? Archaeology cannot answer this directly. The Earth is quiet about its deepest stories. But the distribution of anomalous sites across deserts, islands, mountains, and river valleys suggests that early human symbolic behavior was not confined to one cradle. It was global. It flickered in many places. It rose and fell with climate, population, and memory. By the time the first civilizations appear in Sumer, Egypt, and the Indus Valley, many of these earlier lights have already gone out. What remains are their faint reflections, embedded in myths, rituals, and architectural instincts. The forbidden layers remind us that civilization did not rise from nothing. It rose from the buried fragments of worlds older than we can yet measure. But fragments alone cannot explain why the earliest civilizations begin at such a high level of technical mastery. To understand that puzzle, we must turn to the technologies themselves. The tools, methods, and materials that appear too early, behave too strangely, or exceed the capabilities of later societies. Because the next mystery lies not in stone circles or buried temples, but in the techniques that produced them. If human history followed a straightforward path, the earliest technologies would be the simplest. We would expect crude tools, rough experiments, failed attempts, and gradual refinement over centuries. But some of the oldest archaeological evidence does not behave this way. Instead, it moves in the opposite direction. The earliest examples are often the best. Later ones decline in precision, scale, or consistency. This reversal, this backward evolution, is one of the most unsettling patterns in ancient history. Consider the stone vessels of early Egypt. Crafted from hard materials such as diorite and schist, many of these vessels possess walls thinner than modern engineering would recommend. Their interiors are hollowed with remarkable smoothness, their symmetry near perfect. Some vessels show spiral tool marks so consistent that they resemble the traces of rotary cutting, a technique not associated with simple copper chisels. Yet these vessels appear at the beginning of Egyptian civilization, not the end. As centuries pass, stone craftsmanship becomes simpler. Techniques degrade. Later artisans produce fine work, but not the same kind of work. The peak lies in the earliest layers. A similar pattern emerges in the Serapeum of Saqqara, where massive granite boxes sit in rock-cut chambers. Each box, carved from a single block of stone, weighs tens of tons and displays surfaces polished to near optical flatness. The lids fit so tightly that even inserting a sheet of paper is difficult. No experimental prototypes exist, no earlier attempts, no gradual improvement. Instead, the tradition begins with mastery. In Mesopotamia, early cylinder seals show sophisticated artistry, precise symmetry, and complex iconography. Over time, their detail changes, but the earliest examples stand apart in their refinement. The same applies to early metalworking, where some of the first copper artifacts display purity and uniformity that later periods struggle to match. In the Indus Valley, standardization poses a different problem. The earliest bricks follow a precise ratio, 1 to 2 to 4. This ratio appears across cities separated by hundreds of kilometers. Later layers, however, show declining consistency. The standard weakens, forms diverge, techniques simplify. Why would the earliest phase of a civilization be its most mathematically disciplined? Textile impressions found in early settlements show weaving techniques so intricate that they resemble patterns found in much later cultures. Dye residues suggest a knowledge of color fixation not expected for the period. Even early pottery in some regions shows firing techniques that appear more advanced than those used centuries later. It is as if someone handed these early societies a toolkit, a set of symbolic, mathematical, and practical methods, without handing them the manual explaining how they worked. Over time, the knowledge faded. The tools outlived the context. There are several ways to interpret this. The first is that early societies were far more innovative than assumed. Human ingenuity has always exceeded expectations. When conditions allowed, stable food supply, social networks, shared rituals, complex technologies could appear rapidly. But this explanation does not match the archaeological pattern. Rapid innovation usually leaves failed experiments, yet many early technologies show no developmental arc. They appear fully realized. The second interpretation is the inheritance model. Technologies do not always originate where they are found. They can be carried by migrating groups, taught across generations, or preserved in ritual rather than practical contexts. Under this model, advanced techniques could be remnants of earlier traditions practiced by populations forced to move or adapt. The earliest examples would therefore appear the most competent because they were closest to the original source. This model fits well with the idea of cultural bottlenecks. When memories fracture and societies disperse, only fragments of technology survive. The first generation to rebuild might still remember the methods, but later generations, lacking full context, lose precision. A third interpretation focuses on symbolic technology. Early societies often embed practical methods within ritual frameworks. A technique may persist because it is sacred, not because its practical value is understood. When the ritual fades, the technique weakens. This could explain why some technologies decline over time. What begins as a living practice becomes a formal tradition, then a symbolic gesture, then a lost art. This may account for the peculiar reality that some early monuments appear structurally superior to those built centuries later. For example, at sites around the world, megalithic stone blocks weighing tens or hundreds of tons were moved with techniques not fully understood. Later cultures at the same sites built with smaller stones. The older sections are often more precise, more enduring, and more skillfully made. In the Andes, polygonal masonry with tight interlocking joints appears in early layers, while later layers revert to simpler rectangular blocks. In Egypt, certain Old Kingdom structures show stone cutting techniques that Middle Kingdom builders did not replicate. In the Near East, early irrigation systems demonstrate hydraulic knowledge that later societies simplified rather than expanded. These examples challenge the linear progression narrative. They suggest a deeper story, that human societies inherit more than they invent, and sometimes inherit more than they can maintain. Technological regression is rare in stable environments. It requires disruption, either environmental collapse, population shifts, or the disappearance of skilled specialists. If a society depends on a small group of artisans or ritual experts, the loss of those individuals can erase entire fields of knowledge. This aligns with what we have already seen. The end of the Ice Age scattered symbolic traditions. The 5.9 kilo-year event compressed them. Early civilizations emerged as repositories of fragmented memory. Their technologies may have originated in worlds we cannot excavate, but the backward pattern hints at more than fragmentation. It suggests that some early societies were not inventing new tools. They were trying to preserve old ones. They may have possessed inherited techniques whose origins they themselves did not understand. Imagine using a tool passed down through generations without knowing why it works. You can replicate it as long as someone remembers the steps. But if one step is forgotten, the tool degrades. If 2 steps are forgotten, the tool becomes symbolic rather than functional. If 3 steps are forgotten, the tool becomes a mystery. Civilization is full of such mysteries. What we see as anomalies, early peaks, later declines, may be the residue of forgotten processes. Techniques stripped from their context. Knowledge half remembered. Methods practiced more out of reverence than understanding. This interpretation does not require lost super-civilizations. It requires only the recognition that humanity has experienced cycles of memory and forgetting deeper and older than written history reveals. If early technologies appear too advanced, it may be because the world that produced them is no longer visible. To understand why these cycles occurred, we must examine more than tools. We must examine the forces that erase knowledge, the structures that silence memory, and the cultural processes that choose which wisdom survives and which disappears. Because after technology comes something more powerful, the control of history itself. Civilizations do not collapse only through disaster. Sometimes they collapse through forgetting. A city may burn, a temple may fall, a library may vanish, but the most powerful erasure comes from choices made by people, rulers, priests, scribes, and institutions that decide what knowledge deserves to live and what must be allowed to die. In this sense, history is not simply a record of what happened, it is a record of what survived. When we look at the earliest civilizations, the silence surrounding their origins is not just geological or climatic, it is cultural, it is curated, it is enforced. For every inscription that endures, 100 were never written. For every tablet preserved in clay, thousands perished in wood or leather. For every ritual recorded by a scribe, countless others faded because someone decided they no longer mattered or were no longer safe to perform. The empire of silence is built by omission. Take Egypt. By the time the Old Kingdom emerged, many royal inscriptions already referred to rituals whose meanings were described as ancient or lost. Priests spoke of restoring ceremonies they could no longer fully interpret. The earliest temples contain reliefs showing tools, objects, and symbols that later Egyptians preserved only as decorative motifs. The knowledge had transformed from functional to sacred, and once it became sacred, it became vulnerable. Secret wisdom is the first to disappear when a priesthood falls. In Mesopotamia, dynasties rewrote king lists to legitimize their rule. When a city-state rose to power, it sometimes erased the names of rivals, altered genealogies, or reinterpreted old myths to strengthen political narratives. Libraries were curated by elites. Scribes chose which texts to preserve. Many tablets that survived do so only because they were accidentally fired in destructive city-wide fires. Ironically, destruction saved what careful preservation might not have. The Indus Valley offers a different kind of silence. Its script remains unread. Its cities show signs of systematic planning, but little evidence of palaces, temples, or monumental inscriptions. Without written records, the meaning of its symbols, rituals, and technologies remains locked behind an undeciphered system. We do not know whether knowledge was erased intentionally or simply never committed to materials that could survive. Its silence is total, and its totality is part of the mystery. But the erasure of memory is not limited to the ancient world. Even in later periods, powerful rulers erased the past to strengthen their own narratives. Chinese emperors burned historical documents that contradicted official history. Roman leaders rewrote genealogies and destroyed records of rivals. Medieval monks copied texts they approved of and allowed others to vanish in damp archives. Knowledge lives or dies not only by chance but by decree. The question becomes, how much of early civilization's apparent suddenness is the result of loss rather than emergence? If ancient societies had predecessors, if they inherited fragments of forgotten worlds, then any intentional erasure of these fragments would deepen the illusion that civilization appeared fully formed. A broken lineage looks like no lineage at all. Silence multiplies itself. Sometimes silence arises not from political will, but from human fragility. Early libraries were vulnerable to fire, flood, rot, and insects. Writing materials decayed in humid climates. Oral traditions vanished when elders died unexpectedly. Ritual knowledge was lost when initiates failed to pass it on. Entire bodies of wisdom could disappear in a single generation if the wrong event occurred at the wrong time. This fragility explains why the earliest civilizations seem to stand on intellectual islands. They are not isolated peaks. They are the last visible points of a submerged mountain range. But there is another kind of silence, the silence enforced by worldviews. When societies embrace new religions, new political systems, or new cosmologies, previously accepted knowledge can be labeled heretical, dangerous, or irrelevant. During moments of transition, entire systems of thought can be suppressed. Egyptian religious reforms under Akhenaten obscured older traditions. Later dynasties suppressed his reforms in return. Mesopotamian rulers replaced local gods with imperial ones. Vedic traditions in South Asia shifted dramatically as cultural elites refined ritual systems. Each transition altered the landscape of memory. What survived these transformations was shaped not by accuracy, but by power. This is why the archaeological record often feels like a palimpsest, a manuscript scraped clean and written over multiple times. Under every narrative lies another, and under that one another still. The deeper we dig, the more we realize that the earliest civilizations were aware of their own incomplete inheritance. They expressed this awareness in subtle ways. Priests spoke of restoring the order of the first time. Sumerian scribes wrote of kings before the flood. Indus seals carry symbols whose meanings had already become esoteric by the end of their civilization. Early Chinese oracle bones mention ancestors whose identities appear older than their lineage should allow. These are not the voices of societies confident in their origins. These are the voices of societies trying to salvage what little they remembered. The empire of silence grows strongest when a civilization transitions rapidly. During crises, people prioritize survival over documentation. During migrations, they preserve only what fits in memory. During political upheaval, records become tools of power. And during cultural integration, minority traditions fade beneath dominant ones. The 5.9 kiloyear event created conditions ripe for silence. Migrations broke continuity. Crowding forced new power structures. Fragmented traditions merged unevenly. Some memories amplified, others disappeared. This explains why many early civilizations speak of an age before theirs, yet cannot describe it clearly. They inherited echoes, not histories. Silence also hides itself within language. Words shift, meanings evolve. Ancient terms used to describe technologies, rituals, or astronomical events often lose their original context. A written phrase might appear simple, but behind it lies a world of associations we can no longer access. Every translation from ancient texts is, to some extent, an approximation of an approximation. If the earliest civilizations lacked clarity about their past, what hope do we have? The answer lies not in despair, but in pattern recognition. Silence is not random. It follows shapes. It leaves the edges of erased stories behind. And those edges, when aligned, form a trace of what once existed. We see this trace in myths that converge across continents, in architectural forms that echo each other across time, in symbolic systems that appear fully formed, in technologies that regress rather than advance, in alignments to ancient skies that no longer exist, in the careful efforts of early civilizations to restore knowledge they did not invent, and in the final analysis, silence does not negate the past, it only hides it. To reveal what lies beneath, we must compare all these fragments, the environmental, the technological, the symbolic, the astronomical, the mythological, and the political, because when we place them side by side, another picture begins to form. A picture not of isolated cradles, but of a shared memory. A memory scattered by climate, fractured by migration, obscured by power, and nearly erased by time. In the final part of this journey, we will assemble these fragments. We will ask what world these pieces once belonged to, and why the earlier civilizations remembered it even as they struggled to describe it. When we look back across the long arc of human history, the rise of civilization appears sudden, almost theatrical. Cities blossom in deserts. Writing emerges with structure already intact. Monumental architecture rises from ground that only moments before held simple settlements. Technological mastery appears at the opening of the story rather than its middle, and nearly every early civilization, when asked about its origins, points not to itself but to a time before. A time of gods, a time of kings before the flood, a time of the first occasion, a time when the sky was different, a time now buried beneath silence. This convergence invites a question far older than archaeology and far deeper than myth. What if humanity has lived more than one beginning? Not a beginning erased by gods or cosmic catastrophe, but a beginning erased by nature, by time, by the fragility of memory, and by the quiet collapse of worlds that left no written record. A beginning whose fragments scattered like broken pottery across continents, leaving behind shapes we still recognize but cannot fully reconstruct. This final part of our journey draws together all the fragments we have gathered. The sudden rise of early civilizations, the silent cultures before them, the memories encoded in myths, the astronomical alignments to ancient skies, the technologies that regress over time, the climate shifts that reshaped continents, and the political silences that pruned the tree of history. When aligned, these fragments form the outline of a story older than writing itself. It begins not with cities, but with memories. Humanity emerged from the last ice age, carrying symbolic worlds that had survived through ritual, song, and inherited instinct. These symbolic worlds guided migration routes, cosmologies, technologies, and social structures. But they were fragile. When sea levels rose, they scattered. When climates shifted, they fractured. When elders died in times of famine or flight, the memories they carried evaporated. Still, enough fragments survived to seed the next age. This is why the earlier civilizations behave like sleepers waking after a long dream. They stand up fully dressed. They speak in complete sentences. They build with confidence. They write with grammar. They map the sky with familiarity, as if the constellations had once been intimate companions. The world had changed, but the memory of the world before had not vanished completely. Sumer articulated this memory in the language of kings and floods. Egypt articulated it in the language of divine restoration and the first time. The Indus Valley encoded it in geometry and standardization. Early Chinese cultures preserved it in ancestral lineages and oracle patterns. Across the Atlantic, in Mesoamerica and the Andes, echoes of cyclical cosmology survived long after their origins were forgotten. Different words, different rituals, different continents, but the same pattern. The past was not a void. It was a broken mirror. Archaeology, limited by what survives, reveals only the last reflection of that mirror. The earliest temples, the earliest scripts, the earliest monuments, These are not the first steps of civilization, but the first stabilizations after a long instability. Like sediment settling after a flood, civilization formed where memory fragments converged. This convergence explains the puzzle that launched our journey. Why do the earlier civilizations appear so suddenly and so fully formed? Because they were not starting from zero. They were recalibrating from loss. Climate collapse funneled populations into river valleys. These valleys became repositories of scattered knowledge. Astronomical traditions preserved in oral cultures became codified in stone. Techniques inherited from ancestors became rituals even when their practical rationale was forgotten. Languages isolated by migration preserved linguistic relics from older worlds. And myths, unable to preserve history accurately, preserved structure instead. Every early civilization is a mosaic. Every mosaic is made of fragments, and the fragments come from a world that no longer exists. Was that lost world a single unified civilization? Probably not in the modern sense. There is no evidence of global empires, vast technological networks, or planetary coordination. But what the evidence does suggest is something subtler. A shared symbolic foundation spread across interconnected populations during the late Pleistocene and early Holocene, later shattered by climate chaos. A world not of cities but of ideas. A world not of kings but of architectures of meaning. A world not of writing but of stories that carried astronomical and mathematical insight. A world not of monuments but of patterns encoded in mobility, ritual, and memory. This world broke, but its pieces endured. When environmental pressure eased and human populations stabilized, these pieces recombined into what we now call civilization. But the recombination was uneven. Some regions inherited astronomical fragments and built monuments aligned to ancient skies. Others inherited technological fragments and built with stone techniques that later generations could not match. Others inherited symbolic fragments and developed writing systems that appeared without childhood. This is why early civilization feels familiar and alien at the same time. It is familiar because it carries the bones of an older world. It is alien because the flesh of that world has long decayed. What then remains of that older world? Its traces live in the places where logic breaks, in the sudden beginnings, the orphaned technologies, the mythic chronologies, the alignments to skies long gone, the similarities between cultures separated by oceans, and the rituals that persist without explanation. Its echoes live in the questions we still cannot answer. Why do so many ancient traditions speak of a great cycle ending in water or fire? Why do early cultures insist that knowledge was given, not created? Why do the most advanced artifacts often sit in the oldest layers? Why does writing begin in multiple places at almost the same time? Why does the symbolic world of the Neolithic seem richer than the material record suggests? Why do we sense continuity where archaeology demands rupture? And perhaps the most important question, why does civilization feel like a memory being pieced together rather than a story being written for the first time? We may never uncover the full shape of the world that preceded written history. Its cities, if they existed, may lie beneath continental shelves. Its stories, if they were shared, may have dissolved in the migrations following climatic upheaval. Its technologies, if they were widespread, may have been reforged into rituals long before they were forgotten entirely. But the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. It is evidence of time. Civilization is not a single ascent. It is a series of attempts. It is a conversation across millennia carried through symbols, scars, and stars. We are not the first to look at the sky and long to understand our place in it. We are not the first to build according to patterns we cannot fully explain. We are not the first to inherit stories older than our languages. We are simply the first to record this inheritance widely enough that its fragments may survive the next collapse. If you've enjoyed this journey and would like to travel further with us, feel free to like the video, share it with someone who might appreciate these mysteries, and subscribe so you never miss the next chapter. Your support truly helps keep this exploration alive. The echoes of the lost world are faint, but they are real. They exist in clay, in stone, in myth, in the gaps between what archaeology can measure and what humanity continues to remember without knowing why. And perhaps that is the final lesson. Civilization is not the beginning of our story. It is the beginning of our remembering.